Next, we're going to welcome up Dominic Bocci, who's the Associate Director at the Council on Foreign Relations David Rockefeller Studies Program and Muftah's Religion Editor. He has previously worked as the Islamic Law Programs Manager for the American Society for Muslim Advancement, overseeing the development of the Mufti training program and coordinating the Global Muslim Women's Shura Council. Prior to this position, Dominic worked for the Bureau of Development Policy at the United Nations Development Program, where he worked closely with the Global Commission on HIV and the Law. Former Fulbright Fellow to the UAE and a presidential scholar at the UAC. On the side, he is also a fellow at allout.org and consults with Arcus Foundation. Dominic did his graduate work at Columbia University, focusing on Islam, legal anthropology, and international development, and graduated with honors from University of California, Berkeley, with a bachelor's degree in Middle Eastern Studies and South and Southeast Asian Studies. Thank you.
You didn't have to read it all. Do I just push this? Or is it already on?
It's already on.
I probably don't even need it. All right. So thank you for having me. This is really exciting to be here. I've read all of your work. It's kind of exciting to see everyone here and able to talk about this. The presentation I'm going to give you today is a mix-up of a couple things. One would be the Mufta article that I wrote. It's it's titled The Cultural and Religious Debates Surrounding HIV/AIDS in the Muslim World. But also, I prepared a concept note for the Global Commission on HIV and the Law when they were asking what the relationship was between cultural factors and kind of legal discrimination and stigma. Also, I'll kind of pepper it to hopefully keep you all engaged with personal anecdotes. So I'm kind of still up in the air whether or not I'm going to read the paper or if I'm just going to kind of wing it. If I wing it, though, you'll have to forgive me if I'm all over the place. So let's go with, so I'll generally follow the script so we don't get too far off. But all right, so what you said in my bio, I'm affiliated with all these weird organizations, but I have to admit that I don't speak on any of them right now, otherwise I wouldn't be able to say anything. So this is kind of just from my own personal perspectives of the work that I've done in relation to this. So just to give you a quick overview, I've lived in multiple Muslim countries, specifically Egypt, Lebanon, and the UAE. My professional career has been primarily focused on faith-based advocacy from within the Islamic context and working with other groups that have done that. That being said, when I started working with UNDP, there was this question of, well, we know that law exacerbates kind of treatment and prevention, or exacerbates kind of the rate in which some groups are increasingly susceptible to infection, but also that it prevents a lot of treatment programs in some countries throughout the world. And so they're like, but wait, we know that culture has something to do with this and we need some advice on how that happens. And so I'd studied Islam for a while, and so I was like, well, let me take a stab at it. I can't really share the concept paper, so that's one thing, but they did have regional dialogues throughout the world to basically hear from local activists, whether it was in Africa, Asia, Middle East, or high-income countries. And long story short, I was in attendance at the high-income country one representing the American Society for Muslim Advancement. When we broke out into sessions, I'll never forget talking to some public health advocates and kind of lawyers where, we were posed the question of, well, what do you think are some of the major factors that are inhibiting some of these prevention and treatment programs? And I was like, well, religion and culture. And of course, the lawyer said to me, that's just not relevant. It's law, we need legal reform, we need nothing else. And I was like, well, that's interesting, because to me, at least, legal reform from an anthropological standpoint has a lot to do with culture and civil society groups that would then engage with governments. So it was kind of with that I was able to produce this document and give it to them. So let's go along with the paper. Okay, so basically, from my experience with working with Muslim women and human rights advocates and scholars, it was clear that some cultural practices that occur throughout the Middle East and North Africa have clear links to the spread of HIV, whether it's child marriage, polygamy, prohibitions against condom usage, or even female genital mutilation or cutting, whatever way you want to word it. Gender inequalities as well, especially expressed through the region, might hinder the development and progress of certain groups, therefore increasing their susceptibility to HIV/AIDS. So This is true anywhere in the world. Those at the greatest risk of infection are also engaged in activities such as sex work or same-sex relations, which are condemned by religious doctrine and social norms and often reinforced in law through criminalization. This has had a perpetuating effect on stigma and discrimination, which drives those living with HIV and those most at risk of infection away from testing or publicly disclosing their status. And so particularly the publicly disclosure of their status, which we'll get to later, I think is a particular problem. For many, there's a belief that religion has a major role to play in this, reinforcing, if not causing, the stigma and discrimination, or at least buttressing and the increased marginalization of those vulnerable communities. Whether because those communities most at risk are viewed in terms of their activities, so the actual same-sex conduct or drug usage or female sex work, which frequently, as I mentioned, violate religious and moral norms, or because these groups have been institutionally discriminated against through law, religious law and cultural customs have significant impact on both HIV, why can I never say this? Prevention and treatment programs in many countries throughout the world. So as I noted, some of this stuff with what I drafted for the Global Commission, and again, what I wrote in MUFTA, was a way to explore the relationship between HIV/AIDS and Islam from a bird's eye view. As any good graduate student would know, Islam's not a monolith. There's variations throughout the Muslim world, whether you're talking about the United States or Egypt or Iran, whether it's specific madhabs or just basically cultural deviations of, appropriating religious doctrine to justify, cultural practices. There's just no way that you can speak towards each specific case study. And so one of the reasons that I came here, in fact, was from my little anthropological view of the world, is hoping that there's more ethnographic work actually produced at the local level. It's something that's severely missing from the research that I've seen out there. And so I'm going to give a quick lit review of what I found when trying to figure out what are some of the contributing factors in terms of Islam and HIV/AIDS. But anyway, so what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and point out some major Islamic debates. You're going to be wholly unsatisfied with what I point out. But I encourage you all to not ask me, but to follow up and do your own research on it, because there's no way that I'd be able to answer all these questions anyway. In terms of sources, I'm happy to provide everyone with anything you want. I'm just going to have to go back on my computer and get them because I've deleted all the footnotes, because that's always what happens before you give a presentation if you don't use a PowerPoint. Lesson learned. But anyway, so I'm going to talk to you about the Islamic debates as they relate to important intersections between people, actions, and faith, and how these debates might be applicable to a broader understanding of major trends, both at the local and international level. I have to warn you that my perspective specifically comes from international institutions. So like I said, I haven't done my ethnographic work on this, and so if I were writing a dissertation on this, which I had left, I would have then done field work to kind of like connect what's happening at the international level. But now I particularly work with human rights group policy and funding. What you gonna do? So anyway, so increasingly Islamic legal opinions in the form of both policy statements and fatwas are being issued by many governments and non-governmental organizations, incidentally enough. And a lot of these civil society actors throughout the world are rooting their advocacy efforts in traditional sources of Islam, and they're providing additional voices in Islamic legal debates throughout the world. Again, in this presentation, I'm not trying to answer the question of whether Islam and international human rights law are compatible. I personally think they are, but that's irrelevant for this. And secondly, local variation is going to just drive you all insane, so sorry. But anyway, so what this concept note did attempt to do, even though I've basically qualified myself out of saying anything, is how, quote unquote, Islam views, which you're never supposed to say, specific issues relating to the treatment and prevention of HIV/AIDS. The primary reason for the omission, wait, hold on. Oh, well, sorry. One is never to say Islam views something, because of course there's local deviations, but the problem is that in a lot of the work that you'll find at the international level, there will be, this is what it is. It's a tension that you'll see in a lot of things. I do both. And I do both because sometimes people ask me to, and then you have to qualify and say, well, that's not really true. The point is that the religious debates are always ongoing. So whereas you can capture a specific moment and say, well, this is what the trend is right now, you want to be able to shy away from conclusively saying anything, because it's too large to summarize anyway. But the debates take place on things like the permissibility of homosexuality in Islam, the question of where drug usage fits in, where condoms are at. These are just relevant examples that come up when you try and do this work in relation to HIV/AIDS. Okay, let's just dive in. So one of the things I did in terms of this concept paper is I looked at what was a lit review basically starting from 1980s moving on. The presenters know all too well, better than I, that scholarship basically from the 1980s and 90s was focused on HIV infection rates in Africa, and sometimes examined Muslims, but as a statistical group, if at all. Those articles that did touch on Muslim populations would examine the fact that a number of people living with HIV/AIDS in the Middle East and Africa were drastically lower than the prevalence in other parts of the globe, leading one author to ponder, I think it was 1997, will Egypt escape AIDS? It was not until much later that discourses on the relationship between religion and growing public health concerns began to emerge, and this, whether or not it's valid, produced enduring stereotypes. Religious pamphlets distributed throughout the Middle East constantly claimed by Muslim scholars that HIV/AIDS was a foreign disease, that it wasn't Muslim, it was European and American homosexuals who brought this to us. It's kind of where the world was at the time. But what ended up happening is in the Academy in the United States, on reflecting on these lower infection rates, there started to be studies on why is it that Muslims are not experiencing infection rates at the same rate that other places are in the world. Interestingly enough, or what I found interesting, is that a lot of work was done on saying that it was religious law that ended up preventing Muslims from getting AIDS. So whether or not that was the case, people cited to Islamic regulations on sexuality, the push away from the use of intoxicants. Male circumcision was another contributing factor, which provided a certain degree of immunity of transmission for the Muslim community. Again, other people can talk to that better than I, but despite this fact, a number of studies and journalistic accounts started promoting the fact that the lack of epidemic on the MENA region was a result of was going to be a public health catastrophe. So this is from 2005 from Foreign Policy magazine. There's an article that was titled "The Muslim Face of AIDS." I'm going to read this paragraph verbatim because I think it's interesting. The authors claim that while leaders of Muslim countries have denied the threat of HIV/AIDS, HIV, quote unquote, quietly crept into the most vulnerable populations in the most volatile parts of the world. The article pulls from a range of case studies throughout the world, including MENA region, as well as citing to Nigeria, Thailand, Indonesia, and Pakistan. The author claims that the experience of Muslim communities in Africa and elsewhere in the world in regards to HIV epidemic should have been sufficient warning, and should be sufficient warning, to the MENA region as a whole, and that Muslim countries are ill-equipped to provide civic assistance to counter the epidemic because, quote unquote, the political primacy of the Quran. However, even with their blatant kind of political biases, or what I would say uneducated opinion, or at least in terms of wording, the authors conclude that there is a space for religious leaders in this work, which is interesting, especially in the Muslim world, to basically eradicate and protect local population through faith-based engagement. Perhaps this is what the authors meant when they declare that the West must respect the fact that, quote, socially conservative society, read Muslim communities, will not buy wholesale Western modernity, but instead should be allowed to promote faith-based solutions to social welfare problems. Well, in the past few years, there have been comprehensive scientific studies focusing on the Middle East and North Africa. One very prominent study being in 2010 when the World Bank released Characterizing the HIV Epidemic in the Middle East and North Africa, Time for Strategic Action, which is one of my absolute favorite pieces. But the work, as I indicated in my question earlier, always makes me think of, I think it's the it's a management saying where if you can't measure it, you can't management, or vice versa. If you can't manage what you can't measure, which I always think is an interesting way to think about kind of the narrative that we're all told in terms of HIV in the Muslim world, which is, as I indicated earlier, we know something, we got to do more, surveillance measure, because we have to manage this problem before it becomes out of hand. Neither here nor there. I agree that there needs to be more work, though I question if I really want Middle Eastern governments continually surveilling marginalized sexual communities, but that's neither here nor there either. Anyway, this groundbreaking work concludes that action must be taken by governments in MENA, especially to prevent the emergence of widespread HIV epidemics in very specific communities. So when presentations are given on HIV/AIDS in the Muslim world, almost always, as we've seen today, and you will see with my presentation, it focuses on men who have sex with men, injecting drug users, and female sex work. It's where it's where the data is at, and it's where we can follow. And I think that in terms of where social and cultural issues pop up, they're three very interesting groups to look at. Basically, today, researchers are actually asking again when it comes to social factors, why is it that the Muslim community seems to have such low rates? There's been some recent articles, which I always think are kind of funny, though I don't mean to belittle them at all. I read the titles and I'm like, that's really weird. Quote unquote, Muslims are less likely than Christians and Jews to have premarital sex. I'm not really quite sure where that takes us in terms of socio-cultural study, but in terms of public health, I can see how it could be valuable. But what I wanted to mention is that, a lot of these articles are recognizing the influence of culture and religion on reproductive health and sexuality. Again, I don't think they add much value to discourses on Islam, and I do think they run the risk of characterizing the religion as a universally established set of practices. However, they're a good place to start. But notwithstanding the advances in data collection and analysis on HIV/AIDS in the Muslim world, current academic work in the field of public health and sociology, I personally think would greatly benefit from richer data and ethnographic depth. I think we've heard that earlier today as well. And while sustained interest in HIV-related scholarship should be encouraged and commended, more emphasis, I think, should be placed on sexuality and reproductive health education, which is happening in civil society groups throughout the world. But again, I really think it's the faith-based work that's going to help a lot with anti-stigma and discrimination efforts used to protect those already infected with the virus. I think what we're gonna do now is we're gonna go through kind of what would be a gross summary of things that you probably already know in terms of injecting drug users, female sex workers, and men who have sex with men, to lay it out there with where I have seen some of the debates going in terms of religious arguments. We'll start with injecting drug users. Both injecting and non-injecting drug users are emerging as a major group within MENA regions susceptible to HIV infections. As a major source, route, and destination for the global drug trade, MENA countries, and in addition, Iran and Afghanistan, because I personally, I know the public health community and UNAIDS defines MENA a little bit larger than I would otherwise do, but that's why I throw in the Iran and Afghanistan. Basically, we've seen an increased amount of HIV prevalence in IDUs, which injecting drug users communities. Throughout the use of non-sterile injecting equipment, IDUs often become infected with HIV. The network structure among injecting drug users additionally encourage risky sexual behavior. We saw that with the overlapping circles, which many lead to infection. Discussions around injecting drug users that I've noticed have really focused on kind of Hadith and Quran verses, which are associated with intoxicants. There are some Quran verses that deal with intoxicants, which are seen as temptations that should be avoided so that one may live a prosperous life. And what you see is while injecting drug users are often denied compassion and viewed as straying away from the religion, some scholars are starting to point to again, these are more progressive faith groups, but larger objectives of Islam, so the Maqasid al-Sharia, to say that a lot of the religion doctrine can be read in light of, protecting life, dignity, which may even encourage harm reduction programs. So you see that, I don't know if we talked about it earlier with harm reduction programs, but they're basically public health strategies which may otherwise, quote unquote, tolerate otherwise risky behavior just to reduce the consequences of that behavior. And that those may actually be justified in an Islamic context based on kind of a drug user's personal struggle, so jihad. There's a really interesting book, which if you guys haven't seen it, I mean, I know most of you probably have if you're interested in this topic. It's called, Islam and AIDS. So it's a pretty easy Google search. And it's by Fareed Essek and Sarah Chitty, and it's a edited volume. And in that book, one of the author kind of explores this concept of divine unity, individual piety, and humanity to base an argument for the fact that strong engaged communities are essential to Muslim response to drug addiction. I particularly like the article, so if you want to check that out. The building of community, they say, or she says, this one author, is key to not only helping individuals to avoid sinful intoxicant, but in cases of addiction of HIV/AIDS, this building community based on divine unity is essential to minimizing stigma, which I agree with. Moving on to men who have sex with men, I always love this. So when I was at Columbia, I studied with Joseph Mossad. And so this whole notion of the gay international, if you haven't read the book, Desiring Arabs, but there was another article, it's this whole notion that the identity category of the homosexual or homosexuality in general didn't come. It's not indigenous to the Middle East. There's nowhere to be found in Islam. Rather, it was the Gay International, or the set of institutions and publications by Western-based U.S. organization that came to save the homosexual, ended up actually placing the identity category on the table in the Middle East and actually then created homophobia. It's funny because you can see a tipping of the hat in almost anything you read on men who have sex with men that are attempting to be culturally sensitive to this work, basically saying we recognize that many individuals at the local level may not identify as gay. However, there is this category that we will then put out there that captures the sexual activity so that we can deal with it. I always think it's funny, but anyway, so while many of these reports detail HIV transmission among MSM in the region, they claim that due to non-Western conception of sexuality and the associated stigma of homosexuality as an identity category, that statistics remain largely unavailable and very problematic to collect. I think we've heard earlier today that that's not always true depending on where you are. But despite this problem, a lot of the work definitely points to risky behavior, including having multiple sexual partners, the overlapping injecting drug use, male sex work, which is most certainly there, but it depends on where you are, or at least the prevalence of it, varying condom usage, and MSM engagement with heterosexual sexual behavior. These may not only increase HIV infections among the MSM communities, but also fear and probably, in most cases, reality that the virus will spread to female partners. But to the extent that it passes on to a wife, like does it pass back there? I mean, it may not create a general population epidemic, but it's still an issue, especially in terms of human rights. Debates on homosexuality, as I'm sure you all know from the Islamic context, kind of focus on sodomy, and they're vast. Particularly in regards to what degree, quote unquote, interpretations of Islamic authoritative sources will grapple with the story of Lot, or whether or not, then countries choose to penalize same-sex behavior. It's helpful to remember that same-sex conduct and this might take my hat off to Joseph Mossad, same-sex conduct and sexual identity are different subjects and shouldn't be so sloppily conflated. The Quran doesn't contain the word homosexuality, depending on how you read it. I think it's pretty clear that it doesn't, but it doesn't actually explicitly specify any punishment for sexual acts between same-sex couples. But most scholars that examine this issue do look to the story of Lot for reference, and especially its condemnation of sodomy. However, a lot of the work is based on the Sunnah, so some scholars note that there are references that the Prophet cursed men who engaged in sodomy, and then hadith on top of that would stipulate that death be punishment for sodomy. However, a lot of there are progressive faith groups that are now trying to challenge the authority of that hadith and whether or not it should be seen as valid. So again, this whole issue of neo-ijtihad coming back in, which we can talk about in a second. If you're interested in that kind of work, you should look to Scott Kugel, who, both in his own work, Islam and Homosexuality, and then some of the work he's done for progressive values, there's some re-examination of these sources. He roots his analysis in the distinction between the sexual act and an individual sexuality, and he encourages those reading the Quran to distinguish between a literal, semantic, and thematic reading of the story of Lot. I realize I'm all over the place. How are we doing on time? Okay, so I'll probably, no, okay, let's just go for it. All right, so we still have female sex workers. HIV among commercial female sex workers, as we just heard, is on the rise. The clandestine nature of sex work, however, poses difficulties for those interested in collecting data and about researching the risks associated with such networks. One of the vice chairs of the Global Commission is a woman who I think most of you know. Her name's Shireen Al-Feki, and she actually just wrote a piece for the publication that I work with named Mufta. So I encourage you guys to look up her article on that. It's an interesting piece about sex work in Morocco and kind of her research that she did with networks there. A lot of what's in that article is echoed in her book, Sex in the Citadel, which is probably, if you ask me, one of the best ethnographic studies of kind of sex in the Arab world, though I think that, you know, there needs to be a lot more to challenge that. But again, that's why I like speaking at universities, because a lot of you are doing research that desperately needs to get published. Regarding female sex work, you know, the frequency of client contact, often accompanied by lack of condom usage and attendant drug use, increases the likelihood of female sex workers becoming infected with the virus. Two issues associated with increased vulnerability to HIV/AIDS might be rooted in existing power imbalances that some people say, or you could see patriarchal structures exacerbating that, lack of comprehensive sexual and reproductive rights education for women, which obviously is not necessarily a religious issue, but it's certainly cultural. You know, there's always a line that makes people annoyed, but highly controversial and almost universally condemned, female sex work in the Muslim world exhumes discourses on the nature of sexual practice as regulated by the teachings of Islam. So basically what we're looking at here is unlawful sexual intercourse, and doubled on top of that would be prostitution. So they're both not, if you review the sources, they're not, it's not as clear, but you could see how people would construe this as not being okay. But let's just leave that alone. Other debates surrounding female sex work has focused on the Islamic permissibility of condom usage. Surprisingly, well, at least I found it surprising, there has been kind of increased, I would say, acceptability by a lot of Muslim thinkers that condom usage may in fact be permissible in some cases. People say that it may be justified through an individual wanting to choose the lesser of two evils. Also, there's discussions on condom usage, and if a Muslim knows of their HIV positive status, it would be preferable for him to use a condom, or her, than it would be to inflict harm on another individual. There's been a lot of work done, whether you want to look at the Cairo Declaration, which was funded by UNDP and the regional program on Arabs, or the HIV/AIDS regional program on Arab states, and basically bringing together faith-based groups, both Christian and Muslim leaders throughout MENA, and to agree upon principles across 4 separate fields. It was signed by 80 high-level religious leaders throughout the region. I don't know how much all of you study it, but it was endorsed by the Grand Sheikh of Al-Azhar. This was in 2004. And basically the Cairo Declaration actually supports a faith-based approach to HIV/AIDS prevention and treatment. I'll just read this because I think it's interesting. On prevention, the declaration states that the family is the ground for defending society and that the prohibition of adultery must be emphasized. However, rooting prevention strategies and abstinence and marital faithfulness. However, it does go into the fact that while all HIV/AIDS approaches must be rooted in genuine spiritual principle, they would actually consider innovation of new approach. Why can't I read? Innovation of new approaches, but ultimately in accordance with heavenly laws and based on cultural and spiritual values. It's interesting because I think for me, I didn't expect to see a lot of work being done at high levels in terms of faith leaders signing up, especially because the work that I've seen, civil society groups are rarely in conversation with the higher up people. So there's an interesting conversation that's not being had, if you ask me, between high level policy work and grassroots communities throughout the Middle East and Muslim world more generally. But I guess we can talk about that in a second. I'm going to end because I'll probably just ramble and then confuse people. But what I think, maybe if I'll get on my soapbox for just like 1 second, there's two things that I think are really interesting. One, the civil society work that's happening right now. A lot of it's funded through, I asked a question earlier, through U.S. foundations, European government commissions, but a lot of it's just happening with, mothers talking to their kids, and a lot of it's happening, I think, because of what's going on in the media. You were talking about the cell phone earlier. I think you can expand that to, unfortunately, things like, not unfortunately, it always gets the credit and it's a cop-out because it's not that analytical. Facebook, social media in general. I mean, movies like the 2011 Egyptian film Asma, which is about an HIV-positive woman who basically struggles living under the lack of disclosing of her status. The movie then goes into how she goes on a daytime television show and she's basically faces the opportunity to disclose it on this talk show. I won't tell you what happens, but it's based on a true story of a woman who actually died of a burst gallbladder after she refused to get it operated on because she didn't want to disclose her status. I think things like that are very interesting. I'm going to open it up for questions. Hopefully I can answer them, but thank you.
I just wanted to say, I think the MSM connection to Joseph Massad is particularly interesting, especially when considering that that category, men who have sex with men, kind of comes out of public health response to the culture of like down low back in the 90s. It's a much earlier category, so it'd be interesting to draw the parallels between here and there in terms of that. Who has any questions? I'm sure there's a few at least.
Thank you very much for the talk. It was full of details, and I encourage you to pursue the anthropological next step. I had a question about Egypt, and you mentioned Islam a lot. Did you do any work, or your organization do any work with the Christian population? Because the reason I bring it up is because I sense in Egypt that the church has a very big role and a very big say in running actually the lives of all the Christians that I know, much more than a lot of the Muslim institutions have over the Muslim population. So I just wanted to know if you were aware of how effective, if they had any mechanisms for dealing with drug use and, all of the other issues, male sex, and all of the other issues.
So myself, no, because a lot of the work that I do, or at least with organizations that I work with, pay particular attention to what's happening in the Muslim community. I think that there's always, perhaps it's more lip service than anything else, but there's always quote unquote interfaith dialogue. But I think usually at the international level, that tends to be with kind of high level, let's say a big famous priest and the one Muslim that they can find to talk to each other. That's not to say that they don't want to talk. I just mean to say that these networks don't know very much, or that many people. I think that there's a lot of work to be done in terms of interfaith conversations to happen, let's say in Egypt, but I know that when I was with Asma, when we were trying to look at that issue, there was also violence going on between the Coptic and the Muslim community. So I think it could have been an interesting, and I know that people talked about it, could have been an interesting bridge to learn from each other, i.e. methodologies of kind of human rights advocacy, but that it just wasn't there when I was there. I know that's a wholly unsatisfying answer, but I just think the moment wasn't there, so I think that groups should most certainly look into that, especially in Egypt, because there's such a significant Coptic community. I mean, yeah.